All right, very good. Again, my name's Alan Curtis, like you said, so I'll be kicking off the first portion of our talk here. And really, before we dive into it, I really just want to thank, first of all, Central Region for doing this, as well as obviously our collaborators at Iowa State. I mean, with whom we would have, I mean, we certainly would not have been able to accomplish this study if we did not have that connection there. And Brooke and I have been talking in the past too. It's really quite serendipitous how it all came together. And anyone that's done any kind of social science research probably understands that it's really hard to kind of get it off the ground, especially if you don't have funding or you don't have that existing relationship. So kind of quickly sparing you guys the long story, the short story of this is, Brooke and I, or Brooke kind of spearheaded this in the first place. And, we were trying to find social scientists to work with or a university we could tag team with. And again, coming at them with no funding, in fact, is very hard to kind of get your foot in the door, because that's usually one of the first questions they'll ask. But in this case, we had a connection. We reached out to Dr. Wald, and actually she had an existing connection with a student, Christy, there listed on our slide. And ironically, Christy is also a pathway student in our office now. So it's just kind of this whole situation came together where she had a relationship with the meteorologist or a training meteorologist, and we came along with this idea. And again, without funding, Dr. Wald was more than amenable to working with us and seeing where it went. So again, couldn't do any of this without them involved whatsoever. So Brooke gave a shorter version of this presentation at AMS. We're going to expand on it just a little bit, but given our crowd, kind of the expansion is more into giving you a little background as to the event that actually led up to the actual project. So go ahead and dive into that here. So this is just the overarching radar loop from the event. So this was July 19th, 2018. For reference there, it may be a little bit hard to see depending on the size of your screen. The Des Moines Metro is kind of like just down and left from center there. And you see a whole bunch of tornado warnings popping up there. The color scheme we used was red was tornado warning, unconfirmed. The fuchsia is confirmed. And then eventually you'll see that thicker fuchsia box, which is our tornado emergency. So kind of overarching setup on the day, there was a weak occluded surface low across southern Minnesota, kind of extended down into the central part of the state here. And really had different setups that were going to prevail throughout the day. The convection and the warnings kind of north of Des Moines were primarily low topped along the occluded front there, and they were kind of in an environment that was more conducive to kind of a land spout situation, and we'll kind of dive into more of the hybrid side. But like I said, there was plenty of low-level CAPE, a lot of low-level effective storm relative helicity, and throughout the morning, we had received numerous reports of land spouts to weak tornadoes. Further south, as you got towards the Des Moines Metro, it kind of became more of a hybrid region, transitioning out of a land spout conducive one to a little bit more of a supercell conducive one. And again, kind of a lot of those northern warnings were primarily EF0s and a couple of weak EF1s. But then also, again, referencing the Des Moines Metro there, we had a warm front extending east of the northern metro. And again, along there, we were much more conducive to supercells. Again, sufficient ML CAPE, 2,500 plus, effective bulk shear, 45 knots plus. Again, plenty of effective storm relative helicity, 200 plus. But as with many cases, early afternoon, the convection struggled until it finally got going just east of the metro, fortunately. And those storms, those warnings you see popping up there, initially was the trio of Bondurant tornadoes we'll show pictures of here, and then eventually the Marshalltown and Pella EF3s. Just for reference too, with how operations were that day, there was a lot of catch up being played. Initially, a lot of these updrafts were extremely visible, so you can imagine phone calls, pictures coming in left and right, especially once the tornadoes went up just outside of the metro area. From the actual messaging standpoint, a lot of the messaging revolved around large hail was expected in the days leading up to this. And in fact, there was no SPC slight until the AM update. So moving along, this was kind of the northern conglomerate. So like I said, a lot of picturesque. You can just kind of see from the structure, much more land spout-like, and in a couple cases, like I said, kind of a low top supercell. We had very little damage reported with any of these, again, mostly in rural areas and just a couple of outbuildings, if I recall correctly. So then as we move closer to the actual event, the main event, these were what we call the Bondurant and Ankeny tornadoes. The image on the right is actually taken from a DOT camera pointed north from a suburb called Altoona. And you can see easily two of the three visible at once there. And there was kind of the third one, the original, off into the background. And just for reference, for those that aren't familiar with Des Moines or Central Iowa, here's a picture, overarching picture of the metro itself. The red circle is Bondurant, so that's where the actual tornadoes ended up damaging a number of homes and buildings there. The red arrow off to the right is kind of a rough depiction of where that camera was looking northward. And then for reference with the radar image, I'll step back to that one in a second. The yellow circle is our office and our radar. So we're looking at 15 miles or less sampling wise to the tornadoes in Bondurant itself. But stepping back just a second, just for reference to, notice the radar image, we have T1, T2, T3 labeled on there. And all three of those are the rough locations of the tornadoes. And they are all detached westward by typically a mile or two from the actual parent storm, at least in reference to the radar returns. And then Pella, this was kind of our other big boy of the day. This ended up being an EF3, a mature supercell that developed from the original Bondurant storm. For those that are familiar, this actually did come very close to the town of Pella itself, but ended up just skirting the north side and hitting the Vermeer plant, which is an agriculture machinery plant in the area, with a direct hit. And one thing we do want to mention, since we are talking about TOR emergencies, there was a TOR emergency discussed potentially for Pella during this event, but fortunately the trajectory had it just north, so we ultimately did not issue one for the town of Pella itself. All right, so on to kind of the main event. So Marshalltown. So here's roughly the timeline of events. A couple of things I want to point out as this loop goes through a few times here is Marshalltown itself is northeast of the Des Moines metro, so we're roughly along or near the warm front. And at this point in the loop, we have our mature cell moving through Marshalltown, so I'll wait for it to reset here. But basically, this Marshalltown supercell was roughly struggling. It was producing weak tornadoes early in its life cycle. And it wasn't until a storm merger, which we'll see here, that really ginned it up and turned it into the mature right-moving supercell that produced the EF3, which actually was multi-vortex as well. So you're just about to see the merger here. And then it takes a pretty hard right turn, and just looking at it on radar, it's a nice looking mature supercell. So also another thing we want to point out with a lot of this too is on the timeline. Hopefully you can kind of see the county outline there. Is just take a note at how many tornado warnings are lit up in that county throughout this loop. So we'll have the first one there initially. That storm ended up not affecting Marshalltown, ended up getting canceled. Second one in the northwest part of the county. Then you have your merger, third warning, and then ultimately you'll have your tornado emergency. So I'm just trying to set up the background here to the actual, I guess, research project itself, noting that we did have 4 tornado warnings at one point within the county, 3 of which encompassed, or excuse me, 2 of which encompassed Marshalltown itself, and then the tornado emergency. Throughout this time too, just again from the messaging and the workload standpoint, we had multiple calls to the EM themselves, noting the threat as especially once the TOR merger occurred, the rough timeline that we expected the tornado to approach and potentially affect Marshalltown. And again, this was our first, just of note, our first tornado emergency for the office. And one other thing to note too, and kind of an impetus for the actual research project, which I'll touch on again in just a couple of minutes, is the tornado was reported there entering the northwest portions of Marshalltown at about 4:33. And that actually prompted, or I guess pushed us over the edge in terms of issuing the tornado emergency. But you look at in terms of the actual lead time entering Marshalltown would have been like a -4 minutes. Okay, see if I can get this to play here real quick. There is no sound, so don't worry about this. So the tornado, this is looking into downtown Marshalltown. The tornado is right in front of you there, pretty broad, pretty big guy churning along there. And it's going to be pretty tough to see, but if you look down the road and just to the right of the road, once this tornado moves through, you'll see the the courthouse, kind of the county building there. And it actually did take the top off of that municipal structure. Earlier in the sequence, before this video was actually taken, there is what they call the Raycom building, and it's actually where they run dispatch out of. A complete wall was taken off of that building, and kind of miraculously, no one was severely hurt or injured there, and they did continue to operate out of that building throughout the night. But then as the tornado moved eastward, again, kind of miraculously, it did avoid the one hospital slash medical center in the area, jogging north before going through a few more neighborhoods. Again, throughout all of this, including going through some low-end housing, there were no critical injuries and no deaths with this event, which certainly we are blessed to say that at this point. There was a single death afterwards, but that was during the cleanup stage and not directly attributed to the tornado itself. Again, just couple more background pictures to it. So again, you're looking at one of the neighborhoods there. Again, a lot of older, established neighborhoods, so not always in the best upkeep. The top right image there was the Raycom building. So again, imagine you got a couple of walls. You can look right through that building, and yet they were still able to work dispatch through there throughout the evening. And then in the bottom right there, that is the top, call it the steeple, if you want, for the courthouse or the county municipal building there. So again, pretty extensive damage. And again, we're fortunate to say today that there were no deaths associated with it. So then moving kind of into the research study itself, obviously there were a lot of motivations for this study. I mean, first of all, it was an EF3 hitting a population center. It was our first TOR emergency. Things of that nature are often enough to kind of ramp up some sort of at least local study. But then one thing, we did do a full-blown, an extensive after-action report, which I do believe was given to Central Region and is available if you do want to look at it. But within it, we did a number of interviews, and one thing that really stood out was when speaking to the EM of Marshall County there, that she did note that the TOR emergency did help their response and their ability to, or her ability to do her job. So then obviously hearing that and understanding that there was technically a negative 4-minute lead time to it entering the town, a number of other questions pop up. So if it did help, how did it help? Did everyone know about it? Did you know where to look? Did she know where to look within the warnings for the tags? Did the dispatch know where to look for the tags? Did they even know it was a tornado emergency? What would or could you do with more lead time? Is lead time important for what you would do? So like I said, there's just a plethora of questions that kind of pop up when you hear things like that coming from the EM, as well as, again, like I said, just having this sort of magnitude event coming through. So based on a lot of the above, obviously we want to better understand our partners' needs so we can better help them, because again, after all, the integrated warning team, if we do our job right, it only goes so far if those that receive our warnings and work with us directly, don't fully understand them or have issues receiving them. So again, we want to understand their needs and where we can better meet them. And of course, tied into that, and Brooke will get into some of these details, we want to identify education holes, because we work a lot with EMs, and I think a lot of times we take for granted those relationships, but we don't take it the step further in some cases. Your dispatch centers, your other first responders, city and county officials, do they have that understanding of our products that a lot of our EMs do? So again, Brooke will go into a lot more of that. So with that, I believe I got one more set here. I'll set up kind of the data gathering side of it, and then Brooke will go over a lot of the results section. So with this, again, understanding we've teamed up with Iowa State for this, we grouped it into 2 focus groups. Distinctly, we had our broadcast media. We wanted to understand what they knew and how they understood things, as well as our local officials. We wanted to understand, obviously, how they handled things. In this case, we kept them as neutral as possible. So the broadcasters, they were at the Polk County, so the Des Moines Metro EOC is where that was initiated. And we went up to Marshalltown for the local officials. And also to keep it as neutral as possible, neither Brooke or I had a direct hand in the actual focus group, or at least being at the focus group. Christy actually led it, and again, kept everything about as neutral as possible. Focus groups were 60 to 90 minutes long. Oftentimes, people obviously knew each other within the room, but the recordings, when we went back through them, there were no names, no job titles attached to them, again, so we could keep it as unbiased as possible. Additionally, Christy, when she was going through the questions for the focus groups, they had a progression to them. So they started very basic, just understanding where people got weather information from and what they did with it, and then ranging all the way up to the actual Marshalltown event itself and how they handled that situation, as well as whether or not they even knew of the tornado emergency. So again, kind of with that, that's kind of the quick and dirty background of it. So I will hand it off to, or allow you guys to hand it off to Brooke, and she will go over the results section.
Just switching over the screen right now, so please hold.
All right, are y'all able to see my screen now?
Yes, looks good.
All right, perfect. So Allan gave a really great overview of the event that day, as well as kind of the setup for our talk. So I'm going to dive into our results. So we're going to start by talking about the results from our focus group with our broadcast METs. So first off, within that focus group, we found that they had a pretty heavy reliance on NWS chat whenever they're relaying information to the public. And that included bolstering their confidence whenever discussing storms, as well as explaining any reasoning for tornado warnings and increasing some lead time as they try to talk about this while they're on air. And unsurprisingly, they're all very familiar with intensity tags within tornado warnings, which is expected because these are all meteorologists. And as we got into discussing lead time, that was something that was really important. As Allan mentioned, one of the catalysts for this study was that in the after action review, there was a comment made by the emergency manager that the tornado emergency helped them a lot. And we were a little confused because you technically can't have a lead time with a tornado emergency, at least not much of one, because really in the NWS directive, the threat has to be either ongoing or imminent to a high population area. So having any kind of lead time with an emergency isn't possible most of the time. But because this was the first one for our office and only the second one ever for Iowa, we realized that a lot of our partners may not realize that a lead time on an emergency isn't possible. So that was something we wanted to field, was the lead time for tornado emergencies and the way our public and our partners perceive that, regardless of what we can actually do at the Weather Service, and then also how that compares to any lead time they would want with a base warning. So within our broadcast group, for the base tornado warning, they're very flexible, as we all know, and our broadcast nets can go on air instantly. But they did say that a 5-minute lead time between a warning being issued and having that tornado impacting a community would help them in getting graphics set up and really getting into the right mindset so they can start talking about that kind of situation on air. But with the tornado emergency, they really didn't think that a lead time was necessary because they realized the gravity that a tornado emergency adds to a situation. And they really felt that having that 0 false alarm rate keeps the validity of the product. And if we were to increase any false alarm with a tornado emergency, it would lose the weight that it adds to a situation. So given the choice between having a longer lead time on the emergency or having a 0 false alarm, they would prefer the 0 false alarm. So for Allan and I, as we listened to these recordings after the fact, that was something that was good to hear from our broadcast Mets, because it's something that's in line with the directive and how we act whenever we are issuing warnings within the office itself. Some changes that our broadcast Mets noted that they took after the tornado emergency was issued that they said they would not have taken if the base tag had just remained. A couple different things. So first, they provided more detail, and they were confident in doing that because of the elevated tag. And some of that included taking the radar down to a street level zoom of Marshalltown and calling out street names as it was moving through. something they would not have done had we kept the base tag. They also indicated that they used stronger wording, more aggressive messaging, and every participant in the broadcast group indicated that they had an immediate emotional response whenever the emergency wording came across in a warning. With one participant saying, and I'll just quote this directly, "I definitely remember tearing up a little bit, knowing it's a possibility that people could die." So while fatalities, I think, are always in mind whenever we're issuing warnings, especially as they're headed to a populated area, issuing the tornado emergency for our broadcast partners suddenly crystallized that and made it very real very quickly for them. And that changed completely how they were then messaging that event. And I don't think that comes as a surprise with any of this, but it's something that's important to know, especially as a comparison as we look to our local officials. So we're going to jump into this. And do keep in mind that our local officials are not meteorologists. And I'm going to preface this section and maybe give a peek into how this went by saying that after listening to the recordings from the focus group involving our local officials, it changed not only the course for the rest of this study, as you're going to see, but it also was a catalyst for furthering this research and really setting the course for where we're going to take this down the road. So with that little tidbit, let's just kind of jump to the punchline here with what happened in the focus group with our local officials. In this focus group, there was a subset of participants that believed that all warnings had expired before Marshalltown got hit, and that Marshalltown was never in a warning on this day. As you can imagine, that was something that was difficult to hear after this event. The tornado emergency, of course, didn't have much of a lead time, but the tornado warning itself that was first issued had a 39-minute lead time for Marshalltown. As a warning operator and a meteorologist, I think that's something that any of us would kind of be proud of. And I know that within the office, it was something that we generally were feeling pretty good about, given that there were no fatalities with this event and that there was a 39-minute lead time. I think that can generally be a source of pride for us or for anyone on that day. So finding out later that at least some of our partners, not all of them, believed that all warnings were expired and that Marshalltown was not in a warning, that was a difficult pill to swallow. So I think the first reaction that Allan and I had was defensiveness and thinking, well, of course our partners are wrong and we did everything right because there's 39 minutes of lead time and this is completely ridiculous. But as we worked through that, we started repeating this mantra to ourselves: perception is reality. So at this point, it doesn't matter what the lead time is. None of that matters because we have to think about the reality for our partners. And the reality, at least for some of them that day, was that an EF3 tornado ripped through downtown Marshalltown with no warning out. That might not be the truth, but that was the reality that some of our partners dealt with that day. And so armed with that information, we have to figure out, why was there this miscommunication, this misunderstanding, and what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? So there are really two things to unpack here. The first is, why did they believe all warnings had expired? And the second is, why did they believe Marshalltown wasn't in a warning? So the first, with the expiration, is likely playing out here in front of us. So because the storm underwent a merger and the two previous cells were also producing tornadoes, they each had two separate tornado warnings on them. And after the merger, we did do that new single tornado warning. We did issue an expiration statement on that northern cell at 3:52, with the new warning going out at 3:54. And with that being in rapid succession, we do know, and we can't talk about job descriptions just for keeping our partners there anonymous, but we do know that those that had this confusion were also unable to view polygons. So they were receiving warnings just via the text product coming in. And it's kind of an older system that they use, so it comes in slowly. And we know that it's a statewide system. So We had dozens of warnings out for 19 tornadoes that ended up being confirmed this day, as well as the Pella tornado going on at the exact same time as the Marshalltown tornado. So they're sorting through their system that can be a little slow. They're not able to view polygons, and they have to sort out what warnings apply to their county and which warnings don't. So with a rapid succession of an expiration statement followed by a new warning, it is likely that the new warning got missed, and the last thing they saw that came across on their systems was that expiration statement, and they simply missed the new warning. So we believe that that was the source of the confusion for the expiration statement. It still doesn't answer why we thought, or why they thought, that Marshalltown wasn't in a warning on this day, because the truth is Marshalltown was in 4 warnings on this day. So to answer that question, let's take a look at the warning itself. And I have that here on the right-hand side of the screen. And it may be difficult to view just because it's fairly long, but that is actually going to prove my point here. So to be able to see where even a portion of the county is mentioned, you go about 1/3 of the way down in the text product. And at that point, we see northern Marshall County being mentioned. It is likely that our partners stopped here. And this is likely the source of the confusion. Because if in your mind reading a warning, Marshalltown is not in northern Marshall County, you can stop here, this warning doesn't apply to you, and you can move on because you're very busy. And we believe that that is what happened, just because of the inundation of information that was flowing on this day. Because to be able to see where Marshalltown is mentioned, you have to go past halfway in the warning. And then the intensity tags, which were the original point of the study, don't appear until the bottom, which we all know. So we likely believe that this is the source of the confusion. So after the bombshell was dropped early on in our focus groups, our facilitator, who did an outstanding job, was able to slowly guide the conversation back towards the original research questions that we had, and towards those elevated tags. And almost none of the participants in the group knew even what an intensity tag was, but they did express a dire need for warnings to be shorter and more to the point, with a real lack of understanding on where to find information within a warning. After our facilitator described what an intensity tag was and their purpose, a lot of our participants actually saw the usefulness in having that information, but they said that it should be at the top of the warning. Now, right now, we don't have a lot of say in changing the format of our warnings, but I think that that's important to keep in mind as we work with our partners to be able to help them going forward and understanding their needs and where they're coming from so that they can use our information in a way that suits their needs. So later on in the focus group, they talked about actions they would take for a tornado emergency. And I say hypothetical here because most of the participants didn't know that a tornado warning or a tornado emergency existed, much less that there was one issued on this day. So they talked about hypothetical actions they would take if one were to be issued, because this is not what they did on this day. And there was quite a split in opinions on what different partner groups would do. Some indicated that they would use the tornado emergency to staff up and prepare and notify neighboring counties for mutual aid. It was interesting to hear this because they said they would need 30 minutes of lead time for that, which is difficult to get with a base tornado warning, let alone with a tornado emergency. But understanding their perspective is really important with this. On the other hand, we had other partners that said it didn't matter, their actions would be the same because they have protocols that are already in motion during a base tornado warning and they wouldn't do anything any different. And they were very set on their protocols and sticking kind of by the book whenever it comes to tornado response. And eventually the conversation delved into communication between partners and the Weather Service. And there's a real need that was identified here for more communication, and our partners want to converse with us more and ask questions directly from the meteorologists to these partner groups. And that opens up the door for figuring out, well, If they want more communication, what are ways that we can provide it and what's going to work for them? Our broadcast meteorologist noted that using NWS chat was something they relied on heavily. And that is something that is currently an option for our various partners across the state. Many of them have either signed up and are not active or have simply not signed up at all. So it's something our office is going to try to push a little more moving forward. There are a couple of reasons NWS chat would be a great option. One is, of course, the direct communication that can occur. And the other is that using the web-based version, our partners are able to view polygons, which is one of the sources of confusion that occurred earlier with the warning issuance as far as expiration and not understanding that Marshalltown was in a warning. So having that visual way to view polygons would be a great method for those partners. It is important to note, though, that not all partners have this as an option, whether they are in vehicles during response or they simply don't have the screen real estate to give up to another window. So it's not the silver bullet to cure this problem, but it's certainly an option that we're going to want to explore or maybe push a little harder with some of our partners here going forward. So some of our main takeaways as I kind of wrap this up here. On the warning side of things, our broadcast media, of course, were familiar with the elevated tags and appreciate the weight that they can add to a situation. And they really do prefer the no false alarm rate with the tornado emergencies, while understanding that that does mean that there's really going to be little to no lead time on that. And it's something that they're okay with and actually prefer. Meanwhile, on the flip side, we had our local officials who were overwhelmingly unaware of tags and really didn't understand the difference between a warning and an emergency. And truthfully, the warning text was not perceived as useful, with that subset of our participants in this group not believing that a warning was even issued on this storm or for the county on this day. On the communication side of things, we know that flow of communication between the Weather Service and its variety of partners is vital to effective warning dissemination and keeping the public safe. For broadcast media, they rely heavily on NWS chat, as we know, while on the local official side, they are in search of more ways to communicate with the Weather Service. And as mentioned before, NWS chat would be a great option because of the capability of also viewing polygons. However, we know that it's not something that is going to work for all of our partners. Regardless of the approach going forward, we do know that increased and targeted training on Weather Service products, including where to find information within warnings, is needed for all of our partners that fall in the local officials category. Before any of this is done, however, it will require rebuilding trust with these partners and helping to make sure that those relationships are there going forward so that they can be more accepting of any information as it comes from us and as we try to work together on this moving forward. So for our future work, we are in the process of submitting a comment proposal to get some funding for this, and it's nearing completion for submission. And we're going to expand it statewide in a survey format with some embedded smaller focus groups. The reason we want to expand this statewide is because Marshalltown is the town that we know about, but it is likely that there are towns across the state of Iowa and likely across the country that have the exact same vulnerabilities. We just don't know it yet because Marshalltown is the one that got hit. And we know that inevitably this is going to happen again. And we want to make sure that when it does, our communities are prepared for it. So this future study is going to focus on warning dissemination and use, understanding, and how our partners are receiving warning information, as well as evaluating the design of products that the Weather Service sends out so that we can increase the readability, at least in any small way that we can within the Weather Service. Of course, changing the entire format of warnings is a bit outside of our control, but understanding that is going to be something that's very important. And we also want to determine how and when different partner groups want communication from and with the National Weather Service here. So we have a plethora of references here, as well as our IRB review number here from Iowa State. And with that, Allan and I are happy to take any questions that you all might have.
All right, well, great job, Brooke and Allan. This is a really